Yes, I have started the recording and good evening. Good evening and warm greetings from the Chennai Center for China Studies. Great to meet you all in another C3S book conversation. Our today's discussion is on the book War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination with Dr. Robert Spalding, US Air Force retired senior fellow, Hudson Institute. To introduce the topic, Xi Jinping has made his ambitions for the People's Liberation Army perfectly clear. There is no mystery what he wants. First, that China should become a great maritime power, and secondly, that the PLA become a world-class armed force by 2050. In this fight for global dominance, Communist China has thrown out the old rules of war. The Chinese Communist Party strategy for total war has been written out in a book called Unrestricted Warfare, the Chinese book, well known there, that has become their new art of war. In today's talk, our author today takes us inside Unrestricted Warfare. He deciphers the principles of this book, revealing the Chinese belief that there is no sector of life outside the realm of war, showing how the CCP itself has promised to use corporate espionage, global pandemics, and trade violations to achieve dominance. For only by being aware of the tactics, it will be possible to fight back against CCP's creeping influence. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker of the day and author of this book, Dr. Brigadier General Dr. Robert Spalding. He is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. His work focuses on US China relations, economic and national security, and the Asia Pacific military balance. Dr. Spalding has served in senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the Defense and State Departments for more than 26 years and is an accomplished innovator in government and a national security policy strategist. As a senior director for strategy to the president, he was the chief architect of the framework for national competition in the Trump administration national security strategy. He earned recognition for his knowledge of Chinese economic competition, cyber warfare, and political warfare, as well for his ability to forecast global trends and develop innovative solutions. Dr. Spalding's groundbreaking work on competition in secure 5G has reset the global environment for the next phase of cybersecurity in the information age. He is also a skilled combat leader, promoter of technological advances to achieve improved unit performance, and a seasoned diplomat. Under Dr. Spalding's leadership, the 509th Operations Group, the US nation's only B-2 stealth bomber unit, experienced unprecedented technological and operational advances. As a commander, he led forces in the air and on the ground in Libya and Iraq. During the UUV incident of 2016, Dr. Spalding averted a diplomatic crisis by negotiating with the Chinese PLA for the return of the UUV without the aid of a translator. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has lectured globally, including engagements at the Naval War College, National Defense University, Air War College, Columbia University, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and other professional military educational institutions. He also holds a doctorate in economic and mathematics from the University of Missouri and is fluent in Mandarin Chinese. Thank you for joining us and pleasure having you with us, sir. I now request Commodore R.S. Vasan, Director General C3S, to kindly deliver the opening address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bala. First of all, a very hearty welcome to General Spalding, and it's a great honor that C3S is able to host you. In fact, I was going through the reviews on the book, and it's outstanding that it's been reviewed as nearly close to. If you look at the average, it's up to 4.8 to 4.9, and that tells you about the kind of research, the kind of work that has gone into your book. Bala did mention about this book written by the two colonels, and which is now, it was written in 1999, and 20 years later, 2 decades later, everyone is looking at that book with a renewed kind of a focus, because I think when it came out, maybe it was ahead of time as far as the rest were concerned in terms of catching up with China. But as far as China was concerned, it was quite clear as to what its trajectory was, what its ambitions were. And therefore, today, when we are looking at unrestricted warfare, we have live examples of what has happened in the last decade plus, more so under Xi Jinping. Now, this is where I know there's a greater need for the rest of the world to understand the dimensions of an authoritarian society, which has made deep ingresses into democratic institutions. we've been discussing within our think tank on the various forums that China adopts for gaining advantage over its adversaries. So whether it is through technological means, whether it is through university exchange programs, whether it is through the PLA who coming for PhDs, whether it is through simple IPR violations of which China is well known, or it is even in the realm of media. Therefore, it's very interesting to see what the responses of the free democratic world is. So from that context, since there was some time, I was mentioning the recent two documents that the American government has brought out. One was on the NDS 2022, and also another one which came out on the close heels of that on the maritime strategy, which is again a 2022 document. Now, my only observation on all this is that China continues to be ahead of us in these power play games, and we are still trying to respond. Including in these documents, I found that there was more of a response and a reaction kind of a action initiation that has taken place, and not so much as something which will take you ahead of China in its game plan. So, my only aim was to touch upon some of these issues and flag these issues and let the speaker tell us about what is happening. And we will see, of course, at the end of it, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions because there are very young, inquisitive minds with us today who are part of the young minds of Chennai Center for China Studies group. And we are looking forward to a very interesting session and also the interactive session thereafter in the form of a question and answer, which will be posted in the chat box and will be regulated by the research team of CPS. Thank you so much, and I'm sure there'll be plenty that we all look forward to. And over to you, General Spalding. All yours.
Well, thanks so much, and it's an honor to be talking to you this evening in India, this morning in America. With everything that's going on currently in the strait and around the region of Taiwan with regard to the weapons that are currently being used and the actions that are being taken, I think it's becoming much more evident who and what the Chinese Communist Party is. That being said, this war has been waged for several decades, and it's been waged in a way that is fundamentally different from the way that certainly the United States wages war, and also in the way that many of our allies and partners think about war. Clausewitz says that war is politics by other means. In other words, you use force to achieve a political outcome that cannot be achieved in any other way. And in this respect, there's this belief in the West that there is a difference between peacetime and wartime, that mostly the world is at peace, and then there's some kind of geopolitical disagreement that arises, and politics, economics are used to come to some kind of mutually agreeable solution, and if not, then force is used when two states can't come to agreement on whatever the issue is. And this is the way that I was taught about warfare. I had almost 30 years career in the Air Force flying B-2s, and as a B-2 pilot, we were very, very strategically focused in terms of, the conflict. How do we use the B-2 as an instrument of war to create the kind of conditions that will lead to a good outcome according to our national interests? One of the most clear examples of the use of B-2s in this manner was the Kosovo War. In the Kosovo War, we essentially had an army commander, General Wesley Clark, running the war, and his intention from the very beginning was to introduce boots on the ground. And so for the first 45 days of the conflict, as a mission planner, preparing combat sorties for the conflict in Kosovo, our target set consisted mainly of ammo dumps and empty barracks. And it was clear that we were not achieving much results in the first 45 days. The Serbians continued to, hammer at the Kosovars, and General Wesley Clark went to the White House to brief the president, and he recommended that ground troops be introduced into the war in order to bring it to a successful conclusion. The president demurred and essentially said he was not going to introduce ground troops into the war. President Clinton was a child of the 60s and probably harbored some concern that he faced a Vietnam-like situation. And so he said that we were going to use air power. Of course, this was 1999, some almost 10 years after the first Gulf War, where a lot of the investments made in the 90s on precision weapons, on navigation like GPS, networks, computers had come to fruition and really showed the ability of that technology to very quickly subdue and defeat the Iraqi forces. And so he told General Wesley Clark that we were going to use air power. So in that war, the B-2 was used every single night of the war, even on those days where the weather was too bad to launch sorties from Italy in support of flights that were happening in and around Kosovo and Serbia. The United States continued to launch B-2s. And after that meeting with General Clark and President Clinton at the White House, we had a new set of targets that came down pretty quickly. And that consisted of primarily the economic assets of the leaders of Serbia. So these were the elite of Serbia who were supporting Milosevic, and their assets, whether they be warehouses or factories or real estate or banks, began to come under the attack of the B-2. And within 2 weeks, the war was over. And so what this clearly demonstrates, and John Warden talks about this in his discussion of 5 rings theory, that putting pressure on the political leadership is the ultimate way to achieve a political outcome. So it's the ultimate expression of Clausewitz, in saying that war is politics by other means. And Duhet, the Italian air theorist, and General Billy Mitchell from the United States had theorized long ago that air power would enable the air component to bypass the fielded forces and strike directly at the political leadership. And it wasn't really till Kosovo that had completely come into fruition. It was a combination of collecting intelligence about the assets owned by the elite of Serbia, and then placing those on the target list, and then using the combined arms and the stealth capability of the B-2. And a new weapon introduced into that war was the GPS-guided Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM. And so it was the realization of Duhet and General Billy Mitchell's beliefs, all in alignment with Clausewitz, also with Jomini, who talked about the use of force in measured ways to achieve, again, political outcomes. This is what I was taught. This is what I learned. These are the experiences I had. And this was the mindset that I took with me when I went to China as an Olmsted scholar in 2002. I spent all of 2001 learning Chinese Mandarin in the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and then went in 2002 and spent the next 2 years studying classes at Tongji University in Shanghai. Tongji University is a leading civil engineering school in China, but I was not learning engineering. I was taking MBA classes in Chinese. Many of these classes had been essentially copied directly from the Harvard Business School MBA program and were being taught in Chinese at Tongji University. My time there was quite incredible. China had just entered the World Trade Organization. They were growing incredibly. The city of Shanghai had literally been transformed in the last decade. The area where I lived in Pudong, on the east side of the Puxi River, or the Huangpu River, excuse me, was completely developed where 10 years earlier it had been fields. And I was amazed by the growth in China, the economic activity. All of my neighbors were building factories in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. And so this is the context in which the two colonels write their book, Unrestricted Warfare. And it is in the context of what I was experiencing as a young major in the Air Force. In fact, I was so smitten by what I saw, the dynamism, the friendly nature of the Chinese people, that I told my wife when I left, when we left in 2004, that it was my intention to return to China after I retired from the Air Force, to start a business, that it was a very vibrant place, and I really enjoyed, and my family enjoyed their time there. Of course, the Air Force, had more to do with me, and so I went back to fly the B-2. But as I rose through the ranks, this experience in China ended up changing the trajectory of my career. So when all of my colleagues have gone to the Middle East, I went to China. And so the Air Force decided that I should go to, when I went to work in the Pentagon, that I should work on China-related issues. So I first worked in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and there I was responsible for negotiating with the People's Liberation Army on access to military archives associated with the Korean War, so that we could return our missing from the Korean War. The Chinese PLA had controlled the prisoner of war camps of the Korean War, and therefore had records on where our servicemen and women were buried. And it was my responsibility to work with the PLA to negotiate access to archives. That experience of mine really did not change my point of view with regard to China or the People's Liberation Army. I found the negotiations friendly. I found our time together very comforting, in that it seemed that they wanted to cooperate with us, and we were able to achieve our goal of getting access to the archives. This was now 2006 to 2008. So my experience of China was consistent, and it was moving forward, and so was the relationship. In the time that I was in China, China's GDP was less than $1 trillion, about 800 billion, but it was growing fast. My goal then was to go back and fly B-2s, and finally in 2013, the Air Force decided that it was time to groom me to be the senior defense official and defense attaché in Beijing, to basically lead the military delegation in Beijing to represent the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the People's Liberation Army. And so I had a series of assignments that prepared me for that. The first was to be a senior military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and then to follow on to advise the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I advised two chairmen during my time in the Pentagon. The first was an Army general, General Marty Dempsey, and the next was General Dumford, a Marine. Two different views about how to advise the president, and certainly I learned a lot about their approach to being the senior military advisor to the commander-in-chief. And it was my job and my staff's job to prepare him to give recommendations to the president on things that we should do with regard to China issues. And the biggest issue at the time were the islands in the South China Sea. It was in the fall of 2014, so roughly about 4 or 5 months after I had arrived at the Pentagon, that I received from somebody I'd met in New York, a businessman who had a briefing talking about the impact on China relations to our industrial base, to our companies in America. And it was at this point that I realized we had a different conception of war to deal with. And this is when I again picked up unrestricted warfare. So think back now to the Kosovo War, 1999. It's what I would consider to be the height of Western conception of war. Clausewitz and Duhet and Jomini and John Warden and Duhay or Jomini, all come together in 1999 and what is seemed to be maybe the height of American military power. And then these two PLA lieutenant colonels at the time write this very odd document. And it is this odd document that I read in 1999 on the, in the outskirts of the Kosovo War. And I find it very strange and quite frankly, discounted it because I didn't understand it. But in returning to the Pentagon to serve the chairman in 2014, and upon learning of the attacks on our own companies in the United States, I picked up Unrestricted Warfare once again. And this time I read it in the context of all the advancements that had happened in technology, particularly information technology, since the introduction of the iPhone. And since globalization and the massive economic growth that I witnessed only beginning in 2002 to 2004 in Shanghai. And it was in this context that I began to realize that my conception of warfare was stilted in a way that made me less prepared to understand the implications for my country and its political independence and sovereignty in a way that that I would imagine that Iraq may have thought when facing the American forces in 1991, a sense of helplessness, of not being able to defend my countrymen from the predations of the Chinese Communist Party, because I realized that we had not fully understood the way of war for the Chinese Communist Party. And perhaps I would have been much better served if I had more closely studied not John Warden, but John Boyd, who was also retired as an Air Force colonel, was a fighter pilot as well as John Warden, but had a different concept about war, and didn't really write a book, but had a very powerful presentation that he would give in the Pentagon in the times after his retirement. In fact, the Marine Corps was much more interested in the writings and scholarly work of John Boyd than was the Air Force, even though that he was an Air Force colonel. Or perhaps maybe if I had paid closer attention to The Prince by Machiavelli, I would have been better. I would have better understood the Chinese Communist Party. Essentially, what they laid out in so many words, although it was very esoteric, was a doctrine for global political warfare. A doctrine for global political warfare that was enabled by the hubris of the West, the belief that after the end of the Cold War, that the ideology, certainly the way that we go to war in the West, was preeminent, and that the United States and other democracies face no threats from other nations. that, you know, if you could just look at Kosovo or even Iraq, that the military might of America would ensure that nobody would challenge us. And yet here was two PLA lieutenant colonels in the same time, in the height of our preeminence during the Kosovo War, writing that they had an idea and a belief that in opening up, in embracing globalization and the internet as a way to create a international order that was predicated on principles like individual liberty, rule of law, free trade, human rights, that just by opening up our economies and our societies to interaction with authoritarian regimes, that through those interactions, these regimes would be transformed. And these two PLA lieutenant colonels, who were themselves Air Force officers, realized that in opening up to globalization and the internet, the method of war, the method of political warfare that the Chinese Communist Party and the armed wing of the party, the People's Liberation Army, was getting an opportunity to become a global power, just like America had become in the 20th century. But it was going to be a different type of global power. It was a global power that eschewed the elements that I had trained my career to master, and had a new way of thinking. This way was much more in line with the thinking of Silicon Valley companies, who used globalization and the internet to dominate the global economy to the point where they represent only a few companies, a handful, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. These companies dominate the global economy to the extent where they represent 25% of the S&P 500. So powerful were these companies that Europe created an entire law, global data protection regulation, to protect Europeans' privacy. And so important did they think that, you know, the importance of privacy of data, that they instituted this law. But of course, technology has a way of undermining laws, in that it creates new opportunities for doing things that laws can't anticipate. So even global data protection regulation has been an utter failure in Europe in terms of protecting. And today, when I look at and talk to, whether it be military officers from any branch of the service, or I would venture to say any military base in any democracy in anywhere in the world, that the use of the smartphone is a single greatest operational security threat to militaries everywhere. And not only is it a threat to militaries because it reveals everything that you do on a constant basis, but it is also the method of attack of your societies. So where I had trained to fly a B-2, to drop a GPS-guided bomb, to take out a factory owned by an elite in order to put pressure on that elite to withdraw support for Milosevic so that he could go to The Hague and face war crimes trials, that instead my children were being subject to apps like TikTok, which are designed to understand their intentions, their behaviors, their perceptions, and slowly begin to indoctrinate them in different ways of thinking. And that this had joined with the academics of the United States, which had begun to eschew the ideals of the Enlightenment period, and itself develop an ideology that approached a religion. And so the combination of these two, this ability to wage global political warfare enabled through globalization and the internet, and the lack of focus on the principles that underpin liberal democracies, you know, and given the fact that the United States is now reaching its almost 250th year as a nation, that it is all the more appropriate that these things are coming to head as this book is gaining more and more relevance. And so the book War Without Rules seeks to take unrestricted warfare and make it accessible to people who don't necessarily understand how China thinks about war. War Without Rules lays out how unrestricted warfare is not a strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a strategy of the PLA. Rather, it is a doctrine document. And we know in the military that doctrine are the principles learned from wars in the past. And these lessons and principles are applied for success on future battlefields. Well, these two PLA lieutenant colonels were talking about successes that the Chinese Communist Party had gained in the and with the globalization and the internet. And in fact, they were laying out doctrine that the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party could use to become dominant in the face of this overwhelming military power of the West. And what you can see over the last 30 years is they've become extremely successful. They have grown their economy just as they had desired. They have grown their military power to the point where they are on the precipice of invading Taiwan. They are threatening their neighbors. And in fact, it is not just the Chinese Communist Party that has achieved this. They have achieved it with the assistance of the United States and her allies and partners. And more importantly, they've achieved it through the companies and the financial institutions and the academic institutions and the politicians of the West that have been entirely complicit in China, in the Chinese Communist Party's rise. And so I think it's all too important that we study unrestricted warfare. And given the fact that it's very difficult to read, I highly recommend reading War Without Rules, as it brings these lessons to life and shows you exactly how China and the Chinese Communist Party has used the doctrine of unrestricted warfare to become successful in this new age of war. So with that, I would gladly accept questions.
Thank you very much, sir. My colleague, Ms. Sapna, will regulate the questions from the chat box for you. Over to you, Sapna.
Thank you, sir. I'll be reading out each question from the chat box. The first question is from Mr. Balasubramanian. So how can liberal democracies form defense against China's misinformation and disinformation campaigns?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that having any relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, any institution within China, it gives them an avenue for attacking the society. So the United Front Work Group uses all elements of the society to attack the ideology supporting the liberty in a democracy. And so by being economically, financially, academically, politically coupled with China, then you are inviting attack. And so one good example of how this works, particularly with social media, WeChat is a good example of how this works. In China, there is no access to any other nation's social media, only to Chinese social media. And so Chinese citizens, they become dependent on Chinese-based companies for providing social media. So when we think of the Great Firewall, because it's preventing these other apps from being used by the people of China, when we think of that as just a geographic extension of China, we're missing the picture. Because what happens, since the Chinese people have no other alternatives for social media in China, as they leave the borders of China and travel to places like India, to America and other democracies, they bring those social media apps with them. They don't transition to locally or nationally based social media apps. They stay on Chinese social media apps, which continue to be censored and monitored and curated by the Chinese Communist Party. So in effect, by restricting those apps within China, the Chinese Communist Party is creating the effect of widening the circle of the Great Firewall to include the globe. And this Great Firewall now includes your own nation as Chinese citizens come in and use the app. And then if others in your own societies begin to use these apps, then they become part of the Chinese firewall. So when we think about digital, it is very important to recognize that China very early on, and it's stated in Unrestricted Warfare, understood that they needed a digital border. And they have used that digital border to prevent the influx of ideas and ideology into their society. And that is through restricting of apps. And those apps then allow them, the Chinese apps allow them to extend the Great Firewall to encompass the globe. So that's the first part. The second part, because they have access to so much data now, not only the data of the Chinese people, but the data of Americans through this globalization and the internet, they're able to create through their artificial intelligence apps like TikTok, which are highly viral in other democracies for English language speakers. And now this app TikTok becomes a way to understand you through harvesting data from your smartphone, harvesting data about you, and then turning around and serving up videos that appeal to you visually. And in serving up these videos, they're also able to insert videos with messages that support the Chinese Communist Party. So they have, in effect, they have created, because of this doctrine that they developed, and this clearly stated in Unrestricted Warfare, a way to extend the Great Firewall to the globe so that they can influence the populations of democracies without allowing for that influence to come into their own society. So the only way to really protect your society from this is to get them out, to get the Chinese Communist Party out. And it is not sufficient to get their companies out, like WeChat. You know, the Chinese Communist Party has begun to infiltrate Twitter and Facebook. And so to the extent that Twitter and Facebook allow Chinese actors, bots, and actual members of the People's Liberation Army to be on those platforms influencing your population, that those apps should be excluded as well. You have to begin to think in terms of, I can only be coupled with a democracy, and in that democracy, they must strictly limit and eliminate any influence that the Chinese Communist Party has through their companies or their digital media. Does that answer the question clearly?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
So the second question is from Mr. Shubhdi Mondal. In terms of US policy towards Taiwan, do you think it is time for US policy towards Taiwan to move out of ambiguity?
Perhaps. I don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party can be deterred when it comes to Taiwan. I think perhaps the only way that a conflict with Taiwan could have been averted would be for Taiwan to have essentially created their own nuclear program. I think given the fact that they were dissuaded by the United States from doing so, I think it's really left them completely vulnerable. And the Chinese Communist Party, not fearing a nuclear Taiwan, now really has no restraint on force. And the only restraint really comes internally from the Chinese Communist Party in recognizing that once they go down this path, that it is a point of no return. They will begin to lose globalization and the internet and that connectivity with democracies as a condition of becoming militarily aggressive. But that's a self-deterrence. It's not a deterrence that the United States has any control over, because once the Chinese Communist Party considers that they have gained a sufficient amount of resources and technology and talent and capital, that they will themselves begin to shut the door on the West so that they cannot themselves come under attack from sanctions, like Russia did after their invasion of Ukraine. And I believe that they made this decision while President Trump was trying to negotiate the trade agreement. I think when Xi Jinping tore up the initial trade agreement negotiated by Ambassador Lighthizer and Liu He, that they were then making the decision to close off their economy, and they have continued to do so. And so in that case, what they will rely on are the nations that they are closely aligned with, primarily authoritarian, and the nations of the Belt and Road Initiative. And they will use the Belt and Road and those relationships to exclude any nation that doesn't adhere to China's interests.
Thank you, sir. The next question is also from Mr. Balasubramanian. What are your thoughts on the recent happenings in Taiwan?
Well, I think the visit by Pelosi, while many have portrayed it as controversial or maybe creating a crisis or escalatory, that in fact it merely serves as an excuse to the Chinese Communist Party to conduct actions that they are already considering doing. So China has decided it is going to invade Taiwan. It will come at a time of their choosing, and they will seek to use actions by the United States and others to justify that. And this is exactly what's happened with the Pelosi visit.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mr. Darshan. Sir, in your book, you've stated, you've quoted Junzu, all wars is based on deception. So the CCP, it's very easy for the Communist Party of China to wage psychological war against the democratic countries. But is it possible for us to do the same because of the great firewall that exists over the internet in China? How to deal with the firewall? And there are two more questions, sir. You mentioned in your book and in the starting of the talk that war is a continuation of politics by all means. And since politics never ends, never does the war. What are your thoughts on the upcoming political scenario in USA in 2024 and its overall implications on US-China relationship vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific? And what do you think should be the role of the developing countries, including India, to counter China's ambition of global domination?
Yeah, so the first question has to do, can you just repeat the first question?
The first question is, it is very easy for the Communist Party of China to wage psychological war against democratic countries. But it is impossible for us to do the same because of the great firewall that exists over the internet in China. So how do you deal with the firewall?
So in fact, we haven't really tried very hard. I think there are many ways that the United States and allies and partners could begin to get messages. And really, this was the role in the United States during the Cold War of something called the U.S. Information Agency. And so the U.S. Information Agency sought to counter Soviet propaganda. And in 1999, when at the same time that these two PLA colonels were writing Unrestricted Warfare, Secretary Madeleine Albright was dismantling U.S. Information Agency. So restoring public diplomacy, basically truth-telling, as an important element of national power is something that all democracies should highly consider. And we must recognize that today the corporate media has less to do with promoting the principles and interests of the international order that was conceived prior to the end of the Cold War, like individual liberty, rule of law, free trade, and human rights. So we have to recognize that these media agencies like Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, are today conflicted. They're conflicted between, the role of the corporate media, which is to basically promote the ideals of, essentially a global order that really does not represent the principles and interests of any individual society, and therefore undermines the political independence and sovereignty of those nations, and recognize that each nation has its own character. And those principles that underpin the international order come from states that are true to their political independence and sovereignty. And that U.S. Information Agency did so for representing the principles and interests of the United States. And I don't think it is solely the responsibility of the U.S. Information Agency, which no longer exists, but probably should be brought back into service, but also in creating the type of public diplomacy that talks about fact-based media rather than ideology. So that's number one. We actually have to get into the game. In terms of the United States and its political system, I think I have much less faith in the political system now because of the corruption of the corporate and financial sector that has in turn been influenced by the Chinese Communist Party through globalization and the internet. Until we can get a handle on the outside influence of authoritarian regimes in democracies today, that our political systems, whatever they may be, are going to face pressure. This is just a fact. Policy in democracies today is driven by corporatism, it's driven by financial institutions, and those in turn are influenced by the Chinese Communist Party because that is their methodology for waging war. So I don't know that we have a good answer for where American politics are going to go in 2024. And then the last question regarding what can developing nations do, I think there is a lot to be learned from the process by which democracy began to arise, in and around the birth of the United States. There was a lot of philosophy and political study that went into drafting the U.S. Constitution. There was a lot of the principles that underpin the international order as envisioned in the Atlantic Charter. And I think we have to return to that as not just philosophers, but I do think that military officers and certainly those that are interested in national security should study the works of people like John Stuart Mill, study how this idea of liberty began to form and what it means to have individual liberty, and how what is the difference between man-given rights and God-given rights, and how should we look at that in terms of how we conceive a social and political order. These are things that I think we've lost sight of. I think we've become much more corporate in the way that we think about how the world works, and we've become much less focused on the social and political systems that underpin the uniqueness of each of our democracies.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Commodore R.S. Vasan. A very brief glimpse of the National Defense Strategy of 2022 indicates that the number one threat or challenge is now China, way ahead of Russia. In the CNO document, it appears to be looking at material measures and not so much on the other dimension of unconventional or hybrid war. Your take on the adequacy of these two documents to deal with China, sir?
Well, in the biggest problem for Western militaries, and this is the biggest problem for the U.S. military, is that the Chinese Communist Party wages a different kind of war where politics is at the center of warfare. And in fact, most of what unrestricted warfare talks about is non-military means of political warfare. And in fact, the military that I grew up in, that I studied in, the professional military education that I attained while in uniform, had very little to do with politics. We didn't study politics. And so in not understanding, how the Chinese Communist Party fight and in what way they fight, that essentially we have disarmed our thinking. And so it is not surprising that the U.S. military focuses its effort on being efficient and effective on the battlefield, while at the same time being decoupled from understanding the implications of the battlefield to our political independence and sovereignty, and recognizing that perhaps there needs to be a different way of thinking when it comes to warfare. So yes, we are preoccupied in America with, as General Mattis says, killing. We need to be better and better at killing. We need to be better at destroying. And in fact, I think that in this hyper preoccupation with efficiency at the kinetic level of war, that we have completely lost sight of the fact that the war has migrated to other places. Most likely, and the Chinese colonels say this, because of how effective we were on the battlefield. It basically created a need to move from the battlefield in order to be successful, because we had, in effect, become so effective and efficient on the battlefield. And so this is a problem for us. We created our own problem. Our own effectiveness and efficiency on the battlefield meant that the enemy had to devise other methods. And in not going to where the enemy is, but rather saying the enemy must come to us, we've created a very effective and efficient force that over time will become less and less useful as the enemy seeks not to engage it.
So the next question is from Mr. Arjun Iyer. So on the similarities between the China-India war and the China's idea of holding exercise along Taiwan, during the 1962 war, the CCP wanted to distract from the Great Leap Forward, while in 2022, its real estate crisis and the COVID-19 induced recession in China. So is China becoming desperate because a regime change looms its political system?
Absolutely not. And one of the good things about the unrestricted warfare, and in particular its focus on George Soros, is the recognition that a country's financial system can and will be its biggest Achilles heel. And so China devised a financial system that is impervious to attack by essentially closing it. They said, we are not going to allow the renminbi to be to float. It's not a currency that's exchanged. Only the People's Bank of China is legally able to exchange renminbi. And yet they were allowed to enter the global financial system with a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls. And the reason they designed this financial system is because they had seen during the Asian financial crisis how Soros and others had used the free-floating currencies of Asian countries to attack the currency and therefore attack the economies of those countries. And that was devastating for Asia, in the late 80s. And so, late 90s. So this is what the Chinese Communist Party did, in order to prevent that from happening. So yes, they may have financial difficulties in terms of their real estate within China, but they have complete control on capital flight because they have closed off any ability for their currency to, any foreign reserves to leave the country. And so when we think about, how do you protect your society, the Chinese Communist Party devised a way, and we should have cut them off from the international financial order. We should not allow them to trade with free countries because they have a closed financial system, which in effect allows them to continue to extract productivity from those countries without having to let any of that capital go away. So now when they're faced with the banking problems Whereas if they had a floating currency, their financial currency would come under extreme pressure and probably collapse the banking system. Because they have a closed financial system, there's no way to do this today. And so essentially what I'm telling you is that a lot of these Western banks have lent money to China that they're never going to see again, and that was all part of the design. And so I am not concerned at all about China's financial system. In fact, I think it's probably one of the most secure financial systems. Unfortunately, it only benefits the Chinese Communist Party and not anybody else. So, no, I don't think that is an issue driving what's going on with regard to Taiwan at all.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Joe. Given that USA has been relatively careful to skirt around Chinese red lines when it comes to Taiwan so far, will the USA take things much more seriously, serious military, once China has all the necessary logistical lessons to practically conduct an invasion of Taiwan? Or is China's current political issues enough for the USA to gradually ignore Chinese posturing?
I think the only thing that America can do at this point is to offer aid and comfort to the Taiwanese people for evacuation and resupply in the event of a Chinese invasion. We have no ability to counter what China will do for Taiwan. And so it'll be much more like the Berlin airlift than really anything. And I think, it will be so swift and overwhelming that, quite frankly, it won't. America won't have time to really be prepared. But there are going to be a significant portion of the people of Taiwan that want to leave, and I think that we ought to create the conditions that allow them to easily evacuate.
The next question is from Ms. Kritika. What is the US approach to tackle Chinese economic influence?
Well, every time we have a policy, like the CHIPS Act, which is trying to rebuild chip manufacturing in the United States, the corporate sector, in this case, the Semiconductor Industry Association, begins to water down the bill to ensure that these companies can continue to invest in China. So, the corporate sector in the United States and financial institutions and academia in the United States actually is assisting the Chinese Communist Party in slowing down any policies with regard to decoupling of China. So it is, and I would venture to say that this exists in any democracy today, not just in America, that their corporations and their financial institutions lobby the government to prevent them from dissuading their relationships, their economic and financial relationships with China. And this, in turn, creates enormous difficulty in protecting the political independence and sovereignty of a democracy from China's predations. And I think, the political system, national security, foreign policy has to be very aware of their own corporations and financial institutions who are their own worst enemies, and begin to, forcefully reel back their ability to have any interaction with the Chinese Communist Party. And barring that, I would say that the only thing you have left is to capitulate, because if you're going to allow your corporations and financial institutions to partner with China, then you will certainly lose your political independence and sovereignty if you haven't already.
So the next question is from Mr. Balasubramanian. In your view, what are the lessons China learned from the Persian Gulf War of 1990-1991, and how it is applied by China in today's world?
Well, in a very kinetic sense, I think that they learned the benefit of helicopters vis-a-vis tanks in that war, and they talk about it quite specifically. And as a result, I think that you're going to see the heavy use of helicopters in the invasion of Taiwan. So I think there's a lot of people expecting that Taiwan is going to be invaded using the maritime domain. I actually think that Helicopters are going to be heavily used for the invasion, along with ballistic missiles and the air component. So I think they really, I think they took a lot of lessons from the Gulf War on the importance of air power and how that can be used in a military context.
The next question is from Mr. Shubhdi Mondal. Biden's take on China and Trump's take on Beijing. Do you see any difference between the two administrations, especially with their policy-based approach towards People's Republic of China?
No, I don't think so. I think the policy is consistent. I think what the problem is the execution of the policy, and therein lies corporate and financial interests the influence of those corporate and financial interests that I previously spoke of. So I think both administrations have woken up to the challenge posed by China to democracy. The problem is in the White House, for example, you have two organizations: the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. The National Security Council more aligned with the State Department and the Department of Defense. The National Economic Council more aligned with the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. And those are at odds over how we should treat China. And typically the National Economic Council wins because, you know, they say, you know, any policy decision that promotes the national security of the United States and the national interest is going to affect the domestic economy. That's going to be bad for the next election. Therefore, we should not do the things that the National Security Council is saying or recommending. So this, I think this probably plays out, you know, via different agencies in other democracies, but essentially the same thing has happened. You have a war happening within the administrations of democracies where those that support the domestic economy are influenced by multinational corporations and financial institutions, and those that are, you know, that want to support the national security, the political independence and sovereignty of the nation, primarily the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, are essentially excluded from those decisions that would enable them to do their job.
So these are the last two questions. The first question is from Commodore R.S. Vasan. Having been in the service for a long time with deep understanding on military, politics, and strategy, in your assessment, will USA intervene if Taiwan is attacked? And what would precipitate such a course by USA?
I don't think we will, and the reason is it contains the danger of nuclear escalation. And so I think to the extent that America is involved in Taiwan, it will be for the aid and comfort of the Taiwanese people, either in resupply or evacuation. In terms of going to war with China, I think that you know, the American leaders are going to have to contend with the fact that, you know, China is a significant nuclear power, and that going to war with a significant nuclear power carries with it the risk of nuclear war, and therefore we should be very careful and circumspect when it comes to direct confrontation or conflict with China.
So the last question from Kritika. The PLA is engaging in irregular warfare today. The maritime militia is enforcing China's sovereignty claims in the East and South China Sea against US partners and allies. So your views on this?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, sir. The PLA is engaging in irregular warfare. The maritime militia is enforcing China's sovereignty claims in East and South China Sea against US partners and allies. Your views on this, sir?
Yeah, I mean, the maritime militia and Chinese fishing fleets are an extension of the Chinese military, as is basically all elements of Chinese society. It has been designed in that manner. And so when you look at China, you must look at the fact that it is a totalitarian state led by the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Chinese Communist Party is determined to use all elements of the society as its means for achieving its objectives. So you can't say, oh, this company is just a private company, or this fishing vessel is just a private fishing vessel. If it is Chinese, then it is by definition, by the Chinese Communist Party own constitution, an extension of the state, and therefore must be treated as such.
One more question, sir, is from Commodore Araswasan. There is so much emphasis on rule-based order, but on the ground, China seems to be in a position to get away without any actions, as in case of PC. How and what will change this equation?
Again, multinational corporations, financial systems influence the political system to essentially prevent societies from maintaining their political independence and sovereignty. And as long as this prevails in democracies, China will get its way.
Thank you.
That was our last question.
Thank you for questions, and thank you very much for presence. I know to share who we want to.
Thank you, Bala. I think there is some issue with your mic or my mic. I don't know. First of all, I would like to thank the General for this wonderful talk. It is not just about the book, but the whole canvas that is there, which led things from 99 onwards, which is changing the global order. I'm also very happy that there were very important questions from the youngsters over here, and which were well handled. Now, are we having a losing war? That is the impression one gets when you look at the way China has advanced in terms of using its economic strength, its political maneuvering depth ability, and its own ability to now challenge the mightiest superpower USA. So it has worked to a plan, not from 99 onwards. It was actually from the days of Mao, when they pretended to be able to integrate in the global world order. And thereafter, they used every opportunity to gain advantage using the same liberal value systems that the democracy, worships. So this is the lesson that there is, but I'm not too sure, honestly, whether the rest of us, the democratic nations and the liberal democracies, have enough time on their hand to take on the challenge that is now posed by China, politically, economically, diplomatically, militarily. The Taiwan scenario is only one example of how it almost brought China to the brink of war. Why it has stopped short of war, we do not know at this moment. Also, there's another view which is important to understand, is that though on paper it appears that it is gone ahead, the number of friends that it has, which is very limited and you can count them on your fingers, tells you that not everything is gone its way. So these are some of the factors that we need to perhaps examine together to see what are the weaknesses of this system. Yes, we do say that the Chinese single party system is something itself which will perhaps defeat itself. But instead of having those kind of expectations to say that something will happen internally, so it's perhaps a time is needed now to work through international organizations, through the economic organizations which the General mentioned, to apply that kind of pressure which brings it to the table and knock some sense into its head. But this, I think, is perhaps something that is not going to happen in the near future. It will take a lot more time. So all that I would like to say at the end of it is that we're in a difficult period of time, and the coming decade is going to be critical in terms of reevaluating of our options, as far as all the countries are included, not just USA, and therefore to also have many more alternatives to global governance issues. The Quad, the IPF, the AUKUS, all that have provided us options. But unless these are working at full steam, I do not see much success in these new things that we are looking at to bring pressure on China. The ultimate aim, obviously, is to not go to war with China, which is something which all of us understand, but to try and bring China into the mainstream of global governance, where it is a member who respects the universal statutes that are there, whether it is through UNCLOS in the South China Sea, whether it is WHO, which is required to work on the global health, whether it's climate. It was unfortunate that they walked out of some of these major initiatives, of which US is also a partner, whether it is climate change or whether it is the defense talks that were there. So, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think perhaps China has gained everything that it has to by pretending to be integrating with the global order. And today we are at that crossroad where unless we take extreme measures together, we will not be able to defeat the designs of China. Whether it is Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, and closer at home, whether it is the Himalayan borders where they are sitting there eye to eye for the last 2 years. If there be any responses that General would like to, respond to my observations, you may kindly take up for the next 3-5 minutes before the formal Thanksgiving. Over to you, General.
No, I absolutely agree. I think the point is that democracies have to work together, and it can't be just military. It has to be economic. It has to be financial. It has to be academic. It has to be political. And we have to recognize that only by isolating the influence of China from our societies and collectively working together to strengthen our own political, economic, and financial and academic institution towards those principles of liberty that we share, that there is no hope. There are two things. There are two human motivations that drive human activity the most, and they are fear and greed. And as long as the Chinese Communist Party are able to use fear and greed to drive the society of democracies towards inevitable autarky, that we will see our freedoms consistently erode over time.
Thank you very much, General. I think that sums it up, Paul, and it's over to Sapna and Bala for winding up the show. Thank you very much for taking time off early in the morning from USA and being with us. And particularly, I'm sure the youngsters have benefited immensely from your not only the opening remarks, but also your in-depth analysis of the present situation and how we perhaps can still be in a position to put the clock back as if it's possible. But let's look at this challenge and take this head on. Thank you.
Thank you.
I request Ms. Sapna Abraham to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Sapna.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of the entire team of C3S, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks. At the outset, I thank our guest for today and the resource person, Brigadier General Dr. Robert Spalding, for taking out time for the conversation from your busy schedule and enlightening the audience with your knowledge on China and also sharing your experience with us. You were able to explain the contents of the book through the experience that you gained from your serving days, which I'm sure helped the audience to understand the topic and the contents of the book better. I would also like to thank you for patiently answering all the questions that were raised today. Thank you very much, sir. We look forward to engaging with you in the future for many such informative sessions. Now, I express my sincere thanks to all our distinguished members that joined today and for their support that they always render to us. I express our thanks to the Director General of Chennai Center for China Studies, Commodore R.S. Vasan, for the unwavering support and guidance that is provided to the team of C3S, which enables us to excel at our work. I take this opportunity now to thank the audience that joined today, which also includes our interns. You were able to raise some very relevant questions, and we hope the session proved to be a very resourceful one. Last but not the least, I extend my sincere thanks to my colleagues, Mr. Balasubramanian C. and Mr. Shubhdeep Mandal, for their unflinching support and coordination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, General.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.